The year is 71 BCE. Along Rome's most sacred road, the Appian Way, stands a forest of crosses. Not one, not 10, but 6,000. For over 300 miles, wooden beams rise from the stone road, each one bearing a dying man. Merchants pass beneath their shadows. Children ask questions their parents cannot answer. And Rome watches in silence. These are not foreign enemies. They are not criminals. They are slaves. The survivors of the greatest rebellion Rome had ever faced. And yet, among these thousands of broken bodies, one is missing. The man who led them. The man who turned kitchen slaves into an army. The man who forced Rome to bleed. His body was never found. Tonight, we follow the story of the man who vanished from history and became immortal, far beyond the reach of Roman roads, beyond the straight lines and measured stones that marked the edge of civilization. There existed a land the empire would never fully understand. Thrace. A place of mountains and forests, of narrow passes where the wind never rested, and valleys where wolves moved silently through the mist. This was not a land of marble temples or orderly farms. It was a land shaped by hardship, where survival was learned early, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. The people of Thrace were known throughout the ancient world as fierce and unruly. They did not submit easily. They did not bow quickly. Their loyalty belonged to their tribe, their land, and their gods, not to distant kings or foreign laws. Children grew up listening to stories not of empires, but of ancestors who had stood their ground against invaders. Men measured their worth not by wealth, but by courage, endurance, and skill with blade and spear. It was into this world that Spartacus was born. We do not know the year. We do not know the name his mother whispered to him as a child. History, written by Roman hands, did not care to preserve such details. But we know what mattered. Spartacus was not raised to obey. He was raised to survive. From a young age, he would have learned to move through forests without sound, to read the land the way others read written words. He learned when to fight and when to wait. The mountains taught patience. The winters taught endurance. And the constant threat of conflict taught discipline. This upbringing forged something rare. Not reckless bravery, but controlled strength. Spartacus learned the difference between courage and foolishness, between rage and resolve. He understood fear, not as weakness, but as a force that could be mastered. These lessons would stay with him long before Rome ever chained his wrists, before crowds ever chanted for blood, before his name became a whisper of terror in the Senate. Spartacus had already been shaped by a harsher teacher than any Roman general: the land itself. But the world beyond Thrace was changing. To the south, Rome was growing. What had once been a city-state along the Tiber River had transformed into something unprecedented: an empire. Its legions marched farther each year, their standards rising over lands that had never known Roman law. And wherever those standards went, change followed. Resistance meant destruction. Submission meant survival, but at a cost. The Thracian mountains had long resisted Rome's grasp. But resistance always attracts attention. And attention, from an empire like Rome, inevitably brings violence. The collision between these two worlds, the wild freedom of Thrace and the ordered brutality of Rome, was unavoidable. When it came, it would not be a meeting of equals. For Spartacus, this collision would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. A transformation not chosen, but forced. One that would carry him from the silence of the mountains to the roar of the arena, and eventually to the very edge of legend. While the mountains of Thrace shaped men through hardship and silence, far to the south, another kind of force was taking form. Rome, once a modest city on the banks of the Tiber River, it had grown into something the ancient world had never seen before. Not merely a kingdom, not merely a republic, but a system. A vast, interconnected machine that expanded year after year, powered not just by armies, but by human lives. Rome's legions marched with terrifying consistency. Their hobnailed sandals struck the earth in unison, a rhythm that echoed across continents. Where they went, roads followed. Where roads followed, control was established. But conquest alone did not sustain the empire. What sustained Rome was labor. And Rome found that labor in chains. Every campaign followed the same brutal logic. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Those that surrendered were spared, but stripped. Gold and silver were taken first, to fill the treasuries and reward commanders. Livestock followed, then grain, then land. But the most valuable prize was always human. Men strong enough to work fields and mines. Women capable of producing the next generation of laborers. Children young enough to be molded into obedience. War, for Rome, was not simply about territory. It was about supply. The supply of bodies. Across the empire, slave markets became permanent institutions, as essential to Roman life as temples and forums. In these places, humanity was reduced to numbers and categories. A strong back had one price, a skilled craftsman another. A fighter was something special. Roman buyers believed violence could be profitable if properly managed. This belief would shape Spartacus' fate. In the slave markets, men and women were displayed on raised platforms, their bodies examined with cold efficiency, teeth checked for disease, muscles prodded for strength, scars inspected like proof of quality. Auctioneers spoke not of lives, but of features. This one is young. This one is trained. This one has survived battle. The language of commerce replaced the language of humanity. For Rome, this was normal, necessary, even. The empire could not function without slaves. They worked the fields that fed the cities. They mined the metals that forged weapons. They built the roads that carried legions forward. Slavery was not a flaw in the Roman system. It was the foundation. And foundations, when shaken, threatened to bring everything down. To distract its population from this uncomfortable truth, Rome perfected another institution: the arena. Here, violence was transformed into spectacle. Death became entertainment. The suffering of enslaved bodies was reframed as civic celebration. Gladiatorial games were not just amusement. They were propaganda. Each fight reinforced a simple message. Rome controlled life and death. Power belonged to the citizen. Submission was the natural state of the conquered. When a gladiator fell beneath the roar of the crowd, Rome reassured itself that order had been restored. But beneath the sand and blood, something more dangerous was happening. The arena gathered fighters from across the known world. Gauls, Germans, Africans, Greeks, Thracians. Men who had once commanded respect in their own lands were thrown together in shared humiliation. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, remembered different homes. But they shared one thing: they had all been broken by Rome. The empire believed this mixture created division, that differences would prevent unity, that suffering would erase memory. Rome was wrong. Shared pain does not weaken identity. It reshapes it. In the silence of slave quarters, in the shadows of training yards, men exchanged stories. of villages burned, of families lost, of freedom stolen. The empire never imagined that by concentrating its enemies, by training them, by teaching them discipline and coordination, it was planting the seeds of its greatest internal threat. Spartacus entered this world not as a rebel, but as a resource. To Roman eyes, his body was valuable. His scars marked experience. His posture revealed confidence. His gaze suggested intelligence rather than submission. These qualities made him dangerous, but also profitable. And profit always came before caution. Rome believed its chains were unbreakable, that fear could tame any man, that identity dissolved under enough cruelty. It had worked before. It would work again. Or so they believed. They did not understand the man they had captured. They did not understand Thrace. They did not understand what happens when a warrior raised in freedom is forced to kneel. The empire saw only another slave. It did not see the fracture forming inside its own foundation. Rome's hunger would soon consume more than it could control. And when that hunger finally turned inward, it would discover a truth it had long ignored. An empire built on human bondage is never truly secure. It only appears strong until the day the chains begin to break. The moment Spartacus crossed the invisible line between freedom and captivity was not marked by ceremony. There was no announcement, no formal declaration, only iron. History does not record the exact day when he was taken. Roman chroniclers were rarely interested in the details of a slave's capture. To them, such moments were interchangeable, repeated thousands of times across the empire's long frontier. What mattered was the outcome. A Thracian warrior, once shaped by mountains and silence, now stood bound in chains. Perhaps he had fought as an auxiliary soldier alongside Roman legions, lured by promises of pay and protection. Many Thracians did. Perhaps he deserted, unable to endure Roman discipline or orders that violated his tribal code. Desertion, in Rome's eyes, was worse than rebellion. Or perhaps he was simply captured during one of Rome's punitive expeditions, swept up in the aftermath of resistance, when villages burned and survivors were counted like spoils. The truth is buried beneath centuries of silence. But whatever path led him there, the result was the same. Spartacus was no longer a man in Roman eyes. He was property. The chains that bound him were heavy and deliberate. Roman iron was forged not just to restrain the body, but to humiliate the spirit. Prisoners were linked together. one shackle pulling against another, forcing them to move at the pace of the weakest among them. The march south was long. Days blurred into one another under an unrelenting sun. Food was sparse, just enough to keep the captives alive and moving. Water was rationed carefully, not out of mercy, but efficiency. Guards rode alongside with practiced indifference, their eyes trained not on the individuals, but on the line as a whole. To falter was to be beaten. To resist was to be killed. Along the road, Spartacus watched the world change. The wild terrain of his homeland gave way to Roman order. Straight roads cut through the landscape like scars. Fields were divided into neat rectangles. Milestones marked distance with cold precision. This was a land reshaped by control. Villages passed by silently, their inhabitants trained not to look too closely at chained men. Children stared until pulled away. Adults lowered their eyes. The sight was too familiar to provoke outrage. This was Rome's world now. At night, the prisoners were herded into makeshift camps. Chains clinked softly in the darkness as men shifted in restless sleep. Whispers passed between them. Names, fragments of memory. Questions without answers. Spartacus listened. He did not speak often, but he watched. He observed how guards changed shifts, how supplies were counted, how fear moved through both captor and captive. The Romans believed silence meant submission. They mistook observation for surrender. Eventually, the road led them to markets. Slave markets were not hidden corners of Roman life. They stood openly, often near forums and temples, woven into the daily rhythm of the city. Here, the transformation from human being to commodity was completed. Spartacus was stripped and displayed. His body, hardened by years of combat and survival, became an object of inspection. Roman buyers approached with the casual confidence of men accustomed to owning others. Hands pressed into muscle. Scars were traced and discussed. Jaws were forced open to inspect teeth. The language used around him was precise and impersonal. Age, strength, origin. No one asked his name. In Rome, names mattered only for citizens. An auctioneer called out details in a practiced voice, each word calculated to increase value. Thracian, strong, battle-hardened, no visible defects. Coins changed hands. Lives changed ownership. For Spartacus, this moment marked the final severing of his past. Whatever identity he had carried from the mountains was now irrelevant. He was inventory. But Rome's obsession with classification carried a flaw in reducing people to categories. It overlooked individuality. Spartacus' physical presence drew attention, but it was something subtler that set him apart. Even in chains, he stood differently. His gaze did not dart or drop. It rested, steady and unreadable. Not defiant in a way that invited punishment, but not broken either. This unsettled some buyers. Others saw opportunity. Strong slaves were valuable. Strong fighters were priceless. Rome loved violence, but it preferred violence that could be controlled, staged, and sold. That violence had a home. Capua, south of Rome. This city had become synonymous with gladiatorial training. Its schools produced fighters who filled amphitheaters across Italy. Here, death was refined into spectacle. When Spartacus was sold again, his destination was decided. He was sent not to the fields, nor to the mines, nor to a household. He was sent to a ludus, a gladiator school. The journey from the market to Capua was shorter, but no less transformative. As the gates of the school closed behind him, the sound echoed with finality. Within these walls, men were trained not to live, but to die well. The Romans believed this fate was fitting. A warrior would become entertainment. A threat would become profit. They believed the arena would break what remained of his spirit. They did not understand what they had done. By placing Spartacus among other fighters, by training him, disciplining him, and teaching him Roman methods of war, they were not erasing the man he had been. They were sharpening him. The descent into chains was complete. But the descent was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something Rome could not imagine. Behind the high walls of the ludus in Capua, time moved differently. Days were no longer measured by sunrise and sunset, but by pain, exhaustion, and survival. This was not a school in the way free men understood the word. It was a factory. A place designed to take human beings apart and reassemble them into instruments of controlled violence. At dawn, the gates opened. The clang of iron echoed through the stone corridors, pulling men from restless sleep. They rose from straw pallets, bodies already sore from the previous day's training. There was no choice, no negotiation. The routine was absolute. Spartacus joined dozens of other fighters in the training yard. Men from every corner of the known world. Gauls with fierce eyes and braided hair. Germans towering in silence. Africans whose movements carried the memory of distant lands. Greeks who had once known books and philosophy, now holding wooden swords. Here, identity dissolved. Names were replaced with classifications. Thracian, Gaul, African. All were slaves. All were expendable. The trainers, known as doctores, were men who had survived the arena long enough to trade their swords for authority. Their bodies bore the scars of old victories and near deaths, each mark a lesson written in flesh. They taught without mercy. Training began with wooden weapons, heavy and unforgiving, designed to build strength and discipline. Every movement was repeated endlessly. Strike, block, step, turn. Mistakes were punished immediately. A slow reaction earned a blow. A lapse in focus earned worse. The goal was not simply to teach men how to fight. It was to strip away instinct and replace it with obedience. Gladiators were trained to follow commands without hesitation, to move when signaled, to stop when ordered. They learned formations, angles of attack, how to exploit openings. Much of this training mirrored that of the Roman legions. Rome believed this knowledge made gladiators predictable, controllable. But Spartacus saw something else. He recognized the structure beneath the brutality, the logic behind the drills, the way individual movements combined into coordinated force. As the days passed, he absorbed everything, not just techniques, but systems. He watched how trainers corrected mistakes, how authority was enforced, how discipline shaped chaos into order. In Thrace, he had learned to fight as an individual. In Capua, he learned how Rome fought as a machine. This knowledge settled quietly inside him. The arena itself loomed large over the school, a constant reminder of what awaited. Men were taken from training and never returned. Others came back wounded, their eyes distant, their bodies broken. Victors were praised, but even victory offered no freedom. A successful gladiator was simply a more valuable slave. At night, the fighters returned to their barracks. Small stone rooms lined with iron bars. Chains were removed, but never trust. Here, in the half-darkness, conversations whispered through the shadows. Men spoke of home, of mountains, of rivers and families long lost. They spoke of the arena, of the roar of the crowd, of the terrifying moment when a man realized his life depended on the whim of strangers. Slowly, something else began to surface. Anger. Not the wild, uncontrolled rage of desperation, but a colder, sharper resentment. The gladiators understood that they were trained to die. Not for justice, not for honor, but for entertainment. They were spectacles, objects. Spartacus listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was never to inflame, never to boast. His words were measured, carefully chosen. He spoke of discipline, of unity, of the difference between dying in the arena and choosing how to face death. Some men laughed nervously. Others fell silent. Rome believed fear kept men obedient. But fear, when shared, can also bind. The ludus housed hundreds of fighters, but it also concentrated something Rome failed to recognize: experience. These were not farmers or servants. Many were former soldiers, hunters, warriors. Men who had survived battle before chains ever touched them. By placing them together, by training them relentlessly, Rome had created an environment where skills could be exchanged, tactics discussed, and trust, however fragile, could form. The trainers encouraged competition, rivalries, anything to keep men divided. But suffering erodes division. Pain became a common language. The longer Spartacus remained in the ludus, the clearer one truth became: the arena was inevitable. Sooner or later, he would be forced to kill a man he trained beside, or die beneath the cheers of a crowd that would forget his name by sunset. Rome believed this inevitability crushed resistance. Spartacus believed inevitability demanded choice. In quiet moments, he began to consider possibilities. The walls were high, but not impenetrable. The guards were armed, but not always attentive. Weapons existed within the school. Wooden, yes, but still weapons. And beyond the walls lay a world that still feared Rome. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It grew slowly, taking shape with each beating, each disappearance, each night spent staring into darkness. Others sensed the change. They watched Spartacus differently now. Not as a louder man, or a stronger one, but as someone who understood more. Leadership in the ludus did not come from rank or title. It emerged naturally, from competence and calm. When Spartacus trained, men copied his movements. When he rested, they listened. He did not promise survival, He offered something else. Meaning. The trainers noticed the shift, but dismissed it. They had seen men form bonds before. They had seen confidence break in the arena. They trusted the system. After all, this system had worked for generations. Rome had always believed that no slave would choose death over submission. They did not understand the difference between dying without choice and risking death for freedom. The school of death was doing exactly what it was designed to do, but not in the way Rome intended. It was refining Spartacus, teaching him Roman discipline, Roman organization, Roman warfare. And one day soon, those lessons would be turned outward. The walls of the ludus stood firm. The guards slept soundly. The city of Capua went about its business, unaware that within its most profitable institution, a line had already been crossed. The transformation was complete. Spartacus was no longer merely a warrior in chains. He was becoming something far more dangerous. A man who understood his enemy. The spark that ignites a fire is often small, quiet, easily missed. In the ludus at Capua, it did not arrive as a shout or a riot. It arrived as a realization. Sooner or later, every gladiator understood the same truth. The arena was not a test of skill. It was a sentence. Men trained for months, sometimes years, only to die in moments. Their lives decided by a crowd that demanded spectacle and forgot faces. Spartacus understood this early. He saw it in the empty spaces in the barracks, in the beds that were never filled again, in the eyes of men who returned from the arena alive, but already dead inside. The school promised glory, but delivered only delay. Death waited patiently. The question was not whether it would come, but how. For many, this knowledge crushed resistance. They focused on surviving one more day, one more match, one more sunrise. Spartacus chose differently. He began to speak quietly with men he trusted. Not loudly. Not often. Words were chosen carefully. Shared only when guards were distant, and the night pressed close. He did not speak of victory. He did not speak of overthrowing Rome. He spoke of choice. The difference between dying on someone else's schedule and risking death on your own terms. Others listened. Not all agreed. Fear was powerful, and Rome had perfected it. But among the strongest, among those who had already accepted death as inevitable, The idea took root. The spark grew. The opportunity came not from the training yard, but from the most ordinary place in the school, the kitchen. Every day, food was prepared for hundreds of fighters. Bread, stew, simple meals designed to sustain bodies, not spirits. In that space, tools were handled freely. Knives, cleavers, iron spits used to turn meat over fire. Objects so familiar they were overlooked. Spartacus watched the rhythms of the school. He noted when guards relaxed, when attention drifted, when routine created blind spots. Weeks passed. The plan was simple. Simple plans survived stress. They would not sneak away one by one. They would not scatter. They would strike together. 78 men committed themselves fully. No hesitation. No half measures. They understood the cost of failure. If they were caught, death would be slow and public. But if they did nothing, death was guaranteed. The morning came quietly. Sunlight crept into the courtyards of Capua, casting long shadows across stone. The city beyond the walls stirred as it always did. Unaware. Inside the ludus, the gladiators gathered for their meal. The kitchen was warm, thick with the smell of bread and boiling grain. When the signal came, it was subtle. A look, a pause, then movement. Knives were seized. Cleavers swung. The guards had no time to react. These were not desperate slaves striking blindly. They were trained fighters executing a plan. The first moments were chaos. Shouts. The clash of metal. Bodies falling. But chaos favored those who had prepared. Spartacus moved with precision. He did not waste energy. He did not hesitate. Doors were forced open. Weapons racks were broken. Wooden training swords were replaced with iron. Shields meant for practice became tools of survival. The alarm bell rang too late. By the time Capua's authorities understood what was happening, the gladiators were already moving. They fought through corridors that had once confined them. Each step carried them farther from submission. The gates of the ludus stood between them and freedom. For a moment, everything slowed. 78 men stood together, weapons in hand, breathing hard. Behind them lay blood and fire. Ahead lay uncertainty. The gates fell. They did not cheer. They did not pause. They ran. out into the open world. Capua woke to confusion. Citizens barricaded doors. Guards scrambled without coordination. Rome had expected silence from its slaves. Instead, it faced violence. The gladiators did not flee into the countryside at random. Spartacus led them with purpose. They moved toward high ground, toward a place difficult to reach, toward a mountain that loomed dark against the sky. Vesuvius. As they climbed the lower slopes, the sounds of pursuit faded. The city was behind them now. The world felt larger, colder, more real. They stopped only when exhaustion demanded it. 78 men stood together on unfamiliar ground. No longer slaves. Not yet an army. They had no supplies. No allies. No plan beyond survival. But they had something Rome had not accounted for. Momentum. The spark had become flame. What began with kitchen knives had become open rebellion. Rome would respond. Rome always responded. But in that quiet moment on the mountainside, as the sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched across Campania, the escaped gladiators experienced something rare. Silence without chains. And for Spartacus, that silence carried a promise. This was no longer an escape. It was the beginning of war. Mount Vesuvius rose above the plains of Campania like a silent witness. To Roman eyes, it was an inconvenience. A volcanic hill, long dormant. Its slopes covered in rough vegetation and broken stone. To Spartacus, it was salvation. The escaped gladiators climbed steadily, their movements slowing as exhaustion set in. 78 men, wounded, breathless, carrying stolen weapons and nothing else. There was no celebration. Freedom, in its first moments, was heavy. At the higher elevations, the air grew cooler. The sounds of the city faded into distance, replaced by wind and the quiet rustle of leaves. Here, Spartacus stopped. He did not choose the mountain at random. Vesuvius was steep. Its paths were narrow and predictable. The cliffs that dropped toward the sea were considered impassable. To Rome, this meant only one thing: a trap. But Spartacus did not see a trap. He saw terrain. He had grown up in mountains far harsher than this. He understood elevation. Understood that height was advantage. And that enemies who underestimated nature often paid the price. The camp they built was simple but deliberate. Lookouts were posted. Weapons were cleaned and redistributed. Men rested in shifts. Spartacus did not allow chaos. Even now, even with no certainty of survival, he imposed order. This alone set him apart. While his companions slept or stared into the dark, he studied the land, the slopes, the paths, the cliffs. He thought not as a fugitive, but as a commander. Rome's response came quickly. When word reached the Senate that gladiators had escaped, the reaction was not fear. It was irritation. 78 slaves were nothing more than a nuisance, a minor embarrassment. The task of eliminating them was handed to a man whose name history would remember, for the wrong reasons. Claudius Glaber. He was not sent with legions. He was sent with confidence. Glaber assembled a force of roughly 3,000 men. Militia, auxiliaries, soldiers untested in serious combat. Their orders were simple: surround the mountain, block the paths, starve the rebels. Glaber did not believe battle would be necessary. From his perspective, the gladiators were trapped. They had no supplies, no reinforcements, no escape. The Roman camp was established at the base of the mountain. Tents rose in neat rows. Guards took positions along the known paths. The cliffs were ignored. No Roman commander would consider descending them. And Glaber assumed his enemies would think the same. From the Roman camp, Vesuvius looked silent, harmless. But above them, Spartacus watched. He observed the Roman formations, the placement of sentries, the predictable confidence that came with superiority. Rome believed discipline made it invincible. Spartacus understood discipline made men predictable. The plan that formed was daring, but grounded in logic. The cliffs that Romans dismissed as impassable were not smooth walls of stone. They were broken faces, covered in wild vines and uneven ledges. Dangerous, but not impossible. Under cover of night, the gladiators worked silently. They gathered long, tough vines, twisting them into makeshift ropes. Knots were tested repeatedly. This was not desperation. It was preparation. As dawn approached, the Roman camp settled into routine. Soldiers prepared breakfast. Helmets were removed. Weapons leaned casually against shields. Below, discipline softened into comfort. Above, Spartacus gave the signal. One by one, the gladiators lowered themselves over the edge of the cliff. Hands burned. Feet searched blindly for purchase. The descent was slow, each movement deliberate. A single mistake meant death. No one spoke. When the last man reached the base, they did not pause. They moved. The attack came from behind. Romans turned too late. Confusion spread instantly. This was not a disorganized charge. It was a coordinated assault. Gladiators struck tents, supply lines, command posts. Men half-armored were cut down before they could form ranks. Panic replaced discipline. The Roman advantage, numbers, became irrelevant as formations collapsed into chaos. Glaber's men had never faced an enemy like this. These were not slaves begging for mercy. They were trained killers fighting for survival. Within hours, the Roman force was shattered. Those who survived fled. Glaber himself escaped only narrowly. His confidence destroyed along with his reputation. The victory was complete. For the first time in living memory, Rome had been defeated on Italian soil by escaped slaves. The psychological impact was immense. Word spread quickly, not through official channels, but through whispers. Slaves in fields paused in their labor. Household servants exchanged glances. Mine workers listened in silence. The impossible had happened. Rome could be beaten. Mount Vesuvius became more than a hiding place. It became a symbol. Slaves began to arrive. At first, a few. Then dozens. Then hundreds. They came by night, slipping away from estates and workshops. Each arrival brought stories of cruelty, of lost families, of years spent in chains. Spartacus received them all. He did not promise safety. He did not promise victory. He offered purpose. As the numbers grew, the camp changed. What had been a refuge became an encampment. Weapons were forged from stolen Roman supplies. Training resumed. Discipline was enforced. Spartacus understood something vital. Rome would not forgive this humiliation. The empire would respond. And next time, it would not send a man like Glaber. The victory at Vesuvius marked a turning point. The rebellion was no longer a rumor. It was no longer an escape. It was a threat. Spartacus stood at the edge of the mountain, looking down at the plains below. Smoke from the defeated Roman camp still rose faintly in the distance. He knew what this meant. Men would come. More soldiers. Better generals. The road ahead would be long and bloody. But the mountain had spoken. Rome had underestimated him once. It would not make that mistake again. And yet, for the slaves gathering beneath the shadow of Vesuvius, for the first time in their lives, hope felt real. The rebellion had found its footing. An army was forming. Victory changes everything. In the days following the defeat of Glaber's force, the slopes of Mount Vesuvius began to change. What had once been a temporary refuge became a gathering place. Slaves arrived cautiously at first, one or two at a time, moving under cover of darkness, guided by whispers and rumor. They came from fields where they had labored since childhood, from villas where they had served silently, from workshops and mines where the sun never reached. Each carried the same question in their eyes. Is it true? Is Rome truly wounded? Spartacus did not greet them with speeches. He did not celebrate. He watched. He understood that numbers alone did not create strength. Uncontrolled numbers created chaos. The first rule he imposed was order. Men were grouped. Weapons were accounted for. Food was rationed carefully. No one was allowed to wander freely. This surprised many. They had fled masters only to find discipline waiting for them. But this discipline felt different. It was not enforced by fear. It was enforced by necessity. Spartacus explained little, but his actions spoke clearly. If they were to survive, they could not behave like fugitives. They had to think like soldiers. Among the newcomers were men who had once fought Rome as free warriors, former auxiliaries, defeated soldiers from distant campaigns. Spartacus sought them out quietly. He listened to their experiences, their knowledge. From them, he learned how Rome trained its legions, how commands were given, how formations held under pressure. And then he adapted those lessons. The gladiators who had escaped the ludus formed the core of the force. They were disciplined, trained, and accustomed to violence. Spartacus placed them where battles would be fiercest. At the front. At the center. Around them, he built layers. Former soldiers became instructors. Hunters and shepherds became scouts. Men accustomed to long days of labor became supply carriers and builders. What emerged was not a mob, but a structure. Spartacus did something else that marked him as different. He forbade unnecessary cruelty. Roman prisoners taken in skirmishes were not automatically killed. Some were disarmed and released. Others were exchanged. This shocked his followers. Rome had shown them no mercy. Why show mercy in return? Spartacus understood something deeper. Fear spreads faster than brutality. A Roman soldier who returned alive carried stories. Stories of an enemy who did not behave like slaves. Stories that unsettled confidence. The psychological effect was profound. Roman patrols grew cautious. Villages hesitated before offering aid to imperial forces. Spartacus was fighting a war not just of weapons, but of perception. As weeks passed, the rebel force swelled into the thousands. Campfires dotted the mountainside at night, their light flickering like a new constellation. The sounds of many languages filled the air. Different accents, different gods, but one purpose. Training intensified. Men rose before dawn. Drills were slow and deliberate. Movements repeated until they became instinct. There was no glory here, only preparation. Spartacus insisted on discipline even when it was unpopular. Loot was controlled. Arguments were settled quickly. He understood that internal division would destroy them, long before Rome did. Leadership among the rebels did not come from rank, but from competence. Men followed Spartacus because he was calm when others panicked, because he planned when others reacted, because he fought beside them, not above them. He ate the same food, slept on the same ground. This mattered. As the army grew, Rome could no longer pretend it was facing a nuisance. Reports reached the Senate describing thousands of armed slaves moving freely through Campania. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggeration. Rome had faced slave revolts before. They had always ended the same way. But something felt different. This rebellion moved with intention. It avoided strongholds. It struck supply lines. It disappeared into terrain Rome struggled to control. Spartacus understood mobility was his greatest weapon. He refused to let the army settle permanently. They moved often, staying just ahead of Roman responses. Each successful engagement brought more weapons, better armor, greater confidence. And with confidence came danger. Some among the rebels began to speak of revenge, of marching on Roman cities, of burning estates. Spartacus listened carefully. He did not silence these voices outright, but he guided them. He reminded his followers of their goal: freedom. Not conquest. Not empire. Survival. This balance was difficult. Victory had intoxicated many. Men who had once bowed now carried swords. Spartacus knew this moment was fragile. Too much restraint would fracture loyalty. Too much aggression would provoke annihilation. So he chose a path between. The rebel army struck when it needed to, withdrew when it was wise. Always moving, always learning. Roman commanders sent against them grew increasingly cautious. Victories that once came easily now required effort. The legend of Spartacus began to take shape. Not as a king, not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood Rome better than Rome understood itself. By the time winter approached, the rebellion had transformed completely. What had begun with 78 gladiators and kitchen knives had become an army of tens of thousands. An army without banners, without a capital, without a state, yet bound together by something Rome could not command: the memory of chains. Spartacus stood at the edge of the camp one evening, watching fires burn low as men prepared to sleep. The mountains of Vesuvius lay behind them now. The open roads of Italy stretched ahead. He understood that the next phase would be decisive. An army like this could not wander forever. It needed direction, purpose. Soon, he would have to make a choice that would define everything that followed. North or south, freedom or war. The army was born. What it would become remained uncertain. In the spring of 72 BCE, Spartacus made his boldest move. Instead of remaining in the south, instead of continuing a war of raids and ambushes, he turned his army north. This decision caught Rome by surprise. Roman commanders expected the rebels to linger in familiar territory, to exhaust themselves through constant skirmishes, to be worn down by hunger and attrition. Spartacus thought differently. He understood something Rome often forgot. War was not only about winning battles. It was about choosing where not to fight. The road north stretched long and uncertain, but it offered something the south never could: an end. As the rebel army moved through the Italian countryside, its scale became undeniable. What had begun as a scattered uprising now moved like a living organism. Columns of men marched with purpose. Scouts moved ahead quietly. Rear guards watched the roads behind. Carts carried supplies. Blacksmiths worked at night, repairing weapons by firelight. Camp followers, women, children, the elderly, traveled with them, their presence transforming the army into something closer to a migrating people. Roman observers struggled to describe what they saw. This did not resemble a slave revolt. It resembled a nation on the move. Spartacus maintained strict discipline. Villages were not burned without reason. Food was taken carefully, often paid for with captured Roman coin. He understood that terrorizing civilians would turn the land itself against them. The army needed passage, not enemies. As they advanced, Roman forces shadowed them at a distance, unwilling to engage directly. Rome hesitated. Each delay deepened the humiliation. Here was an army of former slaves marching openly through Italy, passing towns and estates, while the legions watched and calculated. Fear spread quietly among Rome's elite. If Spartacus reached the Alps, the consequences would be devastating. Beyond those mountains lay Gaul, Germania, Thrace, lands where Roman authority weakened with every mile. Once there, the rebel army could dissolve. Men could return to their homelands. Rome would lose not only control, but its sense of inevitability. For Spartacus' followers, the sight of the Alps was transformative. Snow-capped peaks rose against the sky, ancient and unmoving. To many, they were more than mountains. They were memory. Germanic warriors spoke of forests beyond Roman reach. Gauls remembered rivers and villages taken from them. Thracians felt the pull of home. Freedom, long imagined, now felt real, close. At night, the camp buzzed with quiet excitement. Fires burned low as men spoke of what awaited them beyond the passes. No more chains. No more Roman law. No more arenas. Just land. And choice. Spartacus listened. He shared their hope. This march north had always been part of his vision. He did not seek to conquer Rome. He sought to escape it, to lead his people out of the empire's grasp, before Rome could gather enough force to crush them. For a moment, it seemed possible. The Alps stood ahead like a promise. But victory carries its own dangers. Not everyone wanted to leave. Among the rebels were men who had never known a home beyond Italy. Slaves born on Roman soil. Gladiators who had spent years fighting for Roman crowds. For them, the North offered uncertainty. Italy, by contrast, offered opportunity. They had defeated Roman armies. They had seized weapons, gold, confidence. Why run now? Why not stay and force Rome to reckon with them? These voices grew louder as the army slowed near the mountain foothills. Debates filled the nights. Some argued for crossing the Alps immediately, before Rome could react. Others argued for turning back south, to continue fighting, to carve out something permanent. Spartacus stood at the center of these discussions, pulled in opposing directions. He understood the logic of escape. Every instinct told him Rome would never forgive this humiliation. That remaining in Italy meant endless war against an enemy with infinite resources. But he also understood the men who followed him. They had tasted power for the first time in their lives. Asking them to abandon it felt like asking them to become refugees once more. Spartacus had never ruled as a tyrant. His leadership rested on consent, on shared purpose. He hesitated. The mountains waited. Snow glinted in the distance. Silent and indifferent, Rome gathered its strength behind them. In this moment, with freedom visible on the horizon, the rebellion reached its highest point, its greatest hope, its most dangerous crossroads. Spartacus did not yet know that the choice made here would determine the fate of everyone who followed him. But history would remember this moment as the instant when victory slipped just beyond reach. At the foot of the Alps, time seemed to pause. The rebel army stood between two worlds. Behind them lay Italy, roads stained by Roman power, fields worked by chains, cities that had cheered their deaths. Ahead lay the mountains, silent, indifferent, guardians of lands beyond Rome's reach. For Spartacus, the path was clear. Cross the Alps. Let the army dissolve into freedom. End the war before Rome could recover. But armies are not made of ideas alone. They are made of men. And men carry hunger, memory, pride. The debates that followed were not shouted. They were whispered at night, spoken in small circles around dying fires. Many had no homeland waiting beyond the mountains. Italy was all they had ever known. Others had grown intoxicated by victory. They had seen Roman soldiers flee. They had held Roman gold in their hands. For them, retreat felt like surrender. Why abandon power now? Why scatter when Rome had proven weak? Some spoke of marching on Rome itself. Others dreamed of carving out a kingdom in the south. Spartacus listened. He argued gently. He reminded them of Rome's patience, of its resources, of its refusal to forgive humiliation. But his voice was no longer the only one that mattered. This army had been built on shared purpose, not fear. Spartacus had never ruled as a despot. He had earned loyalty through trust. Now that trust demanded a price. When the decision was finally made, it was not spoken aloud. At dawn, The columns turned away from the Alps, back toward Italy. Snow-capped peaks faded behind them, their promise unfulfilled. Spartacus rode at the head of the army, his expression unreadable. He understood the weight of what had been lost. The rebellion had passed its moment. From this point forward, every step would be contested. Every victory would summon greater force. Rome would not hesitate again. Yet Spartacus did not abandon his followers. If they chose war, he would lead them. The march south was disciplined. But something had changed. Confidence hardened into arrogance. Hope twisted into expectation. Men spoke less of freedom and more of conquest. Rome, watching from afar, understood immediately. The rebels had chosen to stay. That choice sealed their fate. In the Senate, patience ended. This rebellion would no longer be treated as a disturbance. It would be destroyed. As the army descended into familiar territory, Spartacus felt the narrowing of options. The open roads of Italy now felt like corridors. The land that had once offered shelter would soon offer none. He had won battles. He had outmaneuvered generals. But now he faced something far more dangerous. Rome united. The Alps disappeared behind the horizon, their silence heavy. Freedom had been within reach, and now it was gone. When the Senate turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, it did so without illusion. This was no longer a problem to be managed. It was a threat to be erased. Crassus was not Rome's greatest general, but he was its most ruthless. Immensely wealthy, driven by ambition, and unburdened by mercy. Where others had hesitated, Crassus acted. He was given extraordinary authority. 8 legions, nearly 50,000 men, and more importantly, freedom from restraint. Crassus did not seek a single decisive battle. He sought control. He understood Spartacus' strength lay in movement, so he took it away. Roman forces advanced in coordinated columns, cutting off routes, denying supplies, forcing the rebel army steadily south. Where discipline faltered, Crassus revived an ancient punishment: decimation. 1 in every 10 soldiers who fled was beaten to death by his own comrades. The message was unmistakable. Fear would bind Rome's army tighter than loyalty ever could. Against this, even Spartacus' brilliance began to strain. He fought fiercely. He struck hard when openings appeared. But every victory now cost too much. The land narrowed. The sea closed in. By winter, the rebellion was trapped in the southern reaches of Italy, pressed between Roman steel and barren ground. Spartacus attempted escape. He bargained with pirates for ships. They took his gold and vanished. Rome's net tightened. Crassus waited. He did not rush. He knew time favored empire. And as spring approached, the inevitable became clear. There would be one final battle. Not for freedom. Not for victory. But for dignity. Spartacus understood this. He had delayed Rome longer than anyone thought possible. He had exposed its fear. Now, he would face its full weight. The end was coming. The final battle came quietly. There were no speeches recorded. No last proclamations preserved by history. Only men gathering in the early morning mist. Their breath visible in the cold spring air of southern Italy. Spartacus knew this was the end. The rebel army that formed for battle that day was no longer the confident force that had once marched toward the Alps. Months of constant pursuit, hunger, and exhaustion had worn them down. Yet something remained. Resolve. These were men who had already chosen death once. When they lifted kitchen knives against their masters, they had crossed a threshold long ago. Now they stood not as slaves, but as warriors making a final stand. Across the field, the Roman legions waited in perfect order. Steel glinted beneath the rising sun. Standards fluttered gently in the breeze. Crassus had done what Rome always did best. He had brought overwhelming force. Spartacus did not attempt retreat. There was nowhere left to go. He moved among his men quietly, meeting eyes, offering no false hope. They did not need it. They understood. When the signal came, the rebels charged. It was not reckless. It was deliberate. They aimed not to survive, but to break the Roman line. Spartacus led from the front. Roman historians would later write that he fought like a man already dead. He cut through ranks, driving forward with singular focus, seeking Crassus himself. This was not strategy. It was defiance. For hours, the battle raged. The clash of iron echoed across the hills. Dust and blood filled the air. Men fell by the thousands. The rebels fought with the ferocity of those who understood this moment defined everything. But courage does not negate numbers. Slowly, Inexorably, the Roman legions closed in. The rebel lines bent, then broke. Groups scattered. Cavalry swept the field. And somewhere amid the chaos, Spartacus disappeared. His body was never found. No Roman chronicler recorded his death. No trophy marked his end. It was as if the earth itself had taken him back, refusing Rome even the satisfaction of his corpse. The rebellion ended that day. But Rome was not finished. Crassus understood that victory alone was not enough. Rome needed theater. It needed a message so overwhelming that no slave would ever dare imagine rebellion again. 6,000 survivors were captured. They were marched north along the Appian Way, Rome's most important road. There, at regular intervals, crosses were raised. From Capua to the gates of Rome, the road became a corridor of death. For days, men were nailed to wood, under the Mediterranean sun. Their cries carried across fields and hills. Their bodies twisted slowly in agony. Travelers passed beneath them. Merchants looked away. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. This was not punishment. It was intimidation. Rome wanted the world to see what happened to those who dreamed of freedom. For months, the crosses stood. Flesh decayed. Bones whitened. The road became a monument, not to Roman strength, but to Roman fear. Because no ordinary slave revolt required 6,000 crucifixions. The excess revealed the truth. Spartacus had terrified them. In the Senate, the rebellion was declared ended. But its consequences lingered. Crassus emerged powerful. His name tied forever to slaughter. Pompey arrived late, claiming credit for eliminating fleeing rebels, adding to his own legend. Together, they would soon join Julius Caesar in the first triumvirate. The rebellion of Spartacus did not destroy Rome, but it changed it. Fear hardened policy. Power concentrated faster. Military force replaced persuasion. The Republic moved closer to empire. Rome survived. But it learned nothing. For generations afterward, Roman writers struggled with the memory. They called Spartacus a bandit, a criminal, a dangerous anomaly. Yet they could not stop writing about him. Plutarch recorded his intelligence. Appian detailed his victories. They tried to explain how a slave had nearly broken the world's greatest power. They never asked the real question. What kind of society creates conditions where such a rebellion becomes inevitable? Long after Rome fell, after its roads crumbled and its legions faded into dust, the story endured. Spartacus became more than a man. He became a symbol. To medieval serfs, to revolutionaries, to anyone who looked at power and refused to believe it was eternal. His story survived not because he won, but because he dared. Because he chose resistance when submission promised safety. Because he reminded the world that even empires built on stone and steel rest on human obedience, and obedience can be withdrawn. Somewhere in the hills of southern Italy, Spartacus lies unnamed, unmarked, unclaimed. But his legacy does not rest in a grave. It lives in every moment. When people confront injustice and decide that fear is no longer enough, the crosses along the Appian Way are gone. The empire that raised them has vanished. Yet the question Spartacus asked remains. What is a life worth if it is not free? And so, as night settles and history fades into shadow, we remember the slave who became a general, the rebel who became legend, not because he won, but because he proved that even the mightiest empire could bleed. Thank you for traveling with me through this story. May it remind you, even in quiet moments, that courage echoes longer than power. Sleep well.